Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to those joining us virtually via Zoom. To continue with today's proceedings, we will now have the panel discussion on Future of the New Southern Policy, Building ASEAN-ROK Resilience During the Pandemic. May I please invite the role players for this panel discussion to take their allocated seats. Before we begin, a gentle reminder to those joining us via Zoom, unless you are a role player, please turn off your video and audio feeds during the session to ensure bandwidth for our online presenters. You may place your questions in the chat box. Ms. Izzah, Khairina, Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Is it on? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second panel. We will be talking about arguably something more, well, something of recent topic of conversation. We will be talking about the future of the NSP and building ASEAN and ROK resilience during the pandemic. And as we all know, but before I go, I will start with some quick housekeeping rules. As our MC has spoken, we have to make sure that our online participants do keep their webcams and microphones disabled. We don't want any sort of interference. Thank you. And also as a reminder that as this book launch is a public event, sessions are on the record, just in case anything comes out that we may not want to be re-recorded or brought up again. And sorry. As we can see nowadays, the acute shocks brought by the pandemic has produced different sort of approaches around the world, especially depending on how they think is the best way forward. We've seen countries turn inwards, choosing to act unilaterally, regardless of what's going on around them. Yet at the same time, there are states, on the other hand, who choose to collaborate instead of work alone, using what multilateral engagements and institutions they have at their disposal. This is quite evident with the ASEAN and South Korean relations we have at the moment. They have uncovered new avenues of engagement and cooperation to build resilience in the region. And what better time, I guess, to occur during the formative years of the NSP. Yeah, it's the time after we're a third year into these set of engagements, and even more so, it's marked after the 30th anniversary of the ASEAN-ROK Dialogue. And these sort of disruptive shifts really raises the question on what's going to happen to these relations going forward. Is this going to be a make or break situation for them? And because of that, we should take a few notes in mind. What we are witnessing now is probably going to be exposing or shedding light to the different ways we perceive ourselves as a secure and safe country. The pandemic highlights the importance of non-traditional security issues, and these will be giving a different litmus test to see how resilient really is the region and the states within it. And we're going to question, like, what is the long-term sustainability of health diplomacy? Given how things are nowadays, it seems it's a very topical recent issue, but going forward without the immediate concern of controlling the pandemic, will this remain? And also we be stressing on the importance, as we've seen as of late, how important we have to keep the highly coordinated responses with all members of government and all relevant bodies within it. It highlights that how well do we need to maintain systemic communication? And will this be our leg in for dealing with other issues that we may have never have touched on in the past, such as maybe perhaps tackling the Korean Peninsula issue. And I'm going to be introducing our speakers. We have Associate Professor Dr. Kwek Cheng Chui. We have Dr. Kor Swee Keng. And our discussants who will also be, and Mr. Jeffrey C., who will be joining us virtually in Singapore. And alongside them, we have our discussants, Dr. Choi Yoon Jung, who will also be joining us virtually, and Dr. Noliana Kamarudin. And now I will pass the floor to Dr. Kwek. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Izzah, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to join this panel to share some viewpoints about the subject matter on the evolving ASEAN-Korea partnership. When Dr. Hu asked me to perform the task, her instruction is very, very clear, which is that she wants me to focus primarily on geopolitical aspect, covering dimensions that hopefully to complement the very important subject matters that will be presenting by other fellow panelists. So let me do my job and earn my lunch and perhaps earn my afternoon tea later on by sharing 3 points. And I believe that these 3 points will contextualize the growing importance of ASEAN-Korea partnership as a 3-tier partnership, which I'm going to elaborate later on. Yeah? So the 3 points are 2 hows and 1 why. Number 1, how the current Cold War 2.0 between United States and China are different from the old Cold War between US and Soviet during the last century. So that's number 1. Secondly, how the competition between US and China on both military and non-military dimensions are affecting the rest of us, including or especially those in East Asia, meaning Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. So these are the 2 how that leads to my 3rd point, which is why, precisely because of the evolving Cold War 2.0 and also the emerging twin chessboard competition between US and China on military and non-military, makes ASEAN-Korea partnership, like all other partnerships, becoming more important than before. So these are the 2 how and 1 why that I try to address in my next 8 minutes or so. So first thing first, Cold War 2.0. I know many of us kind of are reluctant to acknowledge that what is going on right now is Cold War 2.0. Even say a few months ago last year, I myself kind of refuse and resist about this categorization. But with what had been going on, I would say especially the recent months, there are indicators that this is a new form of Cold War for a number of indicators. US-China rivalry, animosity are becoming more open, more intense, and more confrontational. They are also openly putting greater pressure on the rest of the world, including and especially their own allies and partners, to take position, if not take sides. And there are already indicators that some of these non-big powers here in the region and elsewhere are indeed aligning closer to US or US initiative like Indo-Pacific, so on and so forth, in one way or another. So those are the kind of indicators and symptoms that all point to the form of a situation that we call as Cold War, but 2.0 in the sense that there are some differences between the current one and also the earlier one. I would point out 3 aspects that this Cold War 2.0 is different from the old one. Number 1, I would say that the economic interdependence. It's one key difference. And it's not just economic interdependence between US and China, but also economic interdependence between China and also, in fact, all of US allies and partners, including us in Malaysia. And second difference is about the regional multilateralism. Regional multilateralism primarily that are centered based in ASEAN. We have all kind of ASEAN-based, ASEAN-led institutions that are something that created during the post-Cold War era, and I do think that they provide the kind of a platform for the interaction between the US and China, but also the rest of the world. And the third difference, which are going to bring me to the second point, is what I've just mentioned about the twin chessboard of US-China rivalry. During the Cold War, the main chessboard is primarily on military field. You will see a military competition. We also see those military competition play out between US and China right now, including or especially those over the South China Sea. But at the same time, over the last few years, I would say 2018 particularly, you see more and more indicators where US and China are not just competing on the military, maritime front, but they are also competing in a number of non-military aspects. For example, infrastructure development. For example, the cyber. For example, the financial. For example, now we talk about the supply chain. And thanks to COVID, we also see some competition over the public health, something that I think Dr. Khaw will elaborate. And these twin chessboard are bringing a number of implications. A, they are broadening the scope of a big power competition. Number two, they are also bringing more players and actors near and far into this big power rivalry. And thirdly, they are also creating more pressure on the rest of us. Again, ASEAN or ASEAN countries are primarily in one of these front line. And I think South Korea, as a US ally, is also in the similar situation. So all these have implication on the evolving and expanding Korea-ASEAN partnership, which brings me to the third point. I do think that with what is going on between the US and China over the military aspect and also the non-military theater, does create some space, despite the pressure, does create some space for the non-big powers to collaborate and maneuver. So I'm saying this as someone who is cautiously optimistic about the situation, in the sense that if we have only one platform, military platform, US-China rivalry is going to bring about regional polarization sooner rather than later. But precisely because of there are non-military platforms as the chessboard between the US and China, we do see some space where there are more cooperation that can be forged either between with the individual countries with China or individual countries with the United States, but also with their partners. So a number of indicators have already emerged. For example, during the COVID, we do see that a number of minilateralism is evolving. We also see a number of, I would say, ASEAN and ASEAN Plus continue to play the role, which is why I do think that in the post-pandemic era, under this Cold War 2.0, Korea and ASEAN could further enhance the role as the three-tier partnership into a greater form. Why I say three-tier partnership is precisely Korea and ASEAN partnership is not just about bilateral between individual ASEAN countries and Korea, but it's also multilateral, meaning that Korea and ASEAN as a group. The third layer is somehow overlooked in the sense that Korea is actually one of the founding members of virtually of all ASEAN-led multilateral platform, which means that those platforms such as ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, such as ASEAN Plus 3, such as East Asia Summit, ADMM Plus, allow countries in ASEAN and also South Korea to engage not just among themselves, but also engage other players. And this is the time that we need more multiple layers of cooperation. And I do think that to do that, ASEAN countries and also South Korea, on the basis of this three-tier partnership, can further collaborate in terms of more accommodative, more adaptive, and in fact, I would say that also in a more innovative way, depending on the emerging needs, especially surrounding the public health cooperation. With that, let me stop. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. So I would like to pose a quick question for that one on your proposal for improving this on a multiple dimensional level. Given we've gotten a lot of criticism or at least discussions that we have too many of these organizations, we have far too many talk shops, as the critics goes. Do you think that expanding this even further, or at least given the growing number of these minilateral engagements since COVID, do you think this is actually going to be bogging down further? Because given this too much pressure to deal with all of them at once?
This itself, I would say, requires a 3-hour response. Since I don't have that, let me make it simpler and quicker. I always describe ASEAN and ASEAN Plus mechanism with 3 I's. Imperfect, sometimes inefficient, but indispensable. So all countries, either ASEAN countries or all the partners, very few, if ever, actually see all these ASEAN and ASEAN Plus platform as the most important or one-size-fits-all solution. But it is indispensable in the sense that you need to have that. It's necessary. But we don't expect that with this platform, we will be able to solve all kinds of problems. Why? Situations at the international level, regional level has always been very complex. You do need multiple tools. But at least with the ASEAN platform, it provides institutionalized arrangements for us to come together. We have problem, we can try to come and solve it, and then we explore. We do not know a lot of, especially with what is currently going on, is very unprecedented. We do not know what really would be the best way, right? So you need to collaborate and then see how things evolve. And I believe this should be the solution, one of the many solutions for not just South Korea, but also ASEAN countries.
That is probably one of the best examples of cautious optimism in the hopes of ASEAN. Thank you very much, Dr. Kwek, for that. Now moving on to Dr. Cole. You give your input. Thank you.
Mic test. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Swee Keng, and I specialize in health systems and health policies. And I'll try to link my understanding of health systems and policies and global health to the topic that we're talking about today, which is a new Southern policy and ASEAN. I'd like to share 3 things, just like Dr. Kwek has done, 3 things as well. The first thing is to talk about what Korea has done really well in their fight against COVID. And there are a few things that Korea has done really well and they've led the world. And building on that, I'd like to focus a little bit about what ASEAN needs at the moment. And then finally, talk about how South Korea can support ASEAN in some of the endeavors that we need for more regional collaboration. So what Korea has done well, what ASEAN needs, and how can we partner together in a mutually beneficial win-win solution. Those are the 3 things that I will just be making sets of comments on. But I'll begin with some reflections of soft power. And previously, soft power, or rather hard power, was measured by your GDP per capita or Human Development Index, or the number of soldiers that you have, or how much advanced technology that you have in military terms. And then soft power during the time of COVID has actually moved to feature how many test kits can you produce in a very short period of time? How many cases do you have? And whether or not your health system is overwhelmed, and how many doctors and nurses and hospital beds can you mobilize in response to the COVID pandemic? And countries that we consider to be traditionally very powerful countries have now proven to be perhaps less powerful than we imagined, because they cannot even ensure basic rights for their own citizens. And with this reflection, let me begin by speaking about the 3 very good things that South Korea has done, and they've really led the world. The first one, or in very simple terms, is test, trace, and vertical integration. It's testing, tracing, and vertical integration. In terms of testing facilities, without going into too much detail about this, South Korea at one point supplied test kits to more than 100 countries around the world. And what this means really is not so much only the productive capacity or the manufacturing capacity of South Korea, but also the regulatory systems, also the science that allows them to be the first mover in providing the test kits in the first place. And that's complemented by a tracing technology that utilizes contact tracing, that utilizes telco data, credit card data, CCTV data, and all manner of data in this whole of society approach that allows very accurate contact tracing to be had. And then thirdly, there's a vertical integration. The vertical integration takes place because it's not only the health system that needs to be in play, but rather the non-health elements of public policy. What I mean to say is you need a legal framework, a regulatory framework, a privacy framework, an education framework, and a one switch to pull them together, in a sense that when you flick the switch, the entire system begins working very well in a vertically integrated fashion. The testing, the tracing, and the vertical integration of South Korea's response was not built overnight. It was built since 2003 in SARS, in 2014 in MERS, and there was enough of a social contract in successive governments to allow such a system to be built. That's what Korea did really well. What ASEAN needs, and moving to the second topic of what I'm going to talk about right now, is more regional collaboration. The whys are very clear. There's a lot of intra-ASEAN movement, a lot of intra-ASEAN trade, there's a lot of intra-ASEAN migration, a lot of refugees as well within the ASEAN region. But there's also the small problem, like Dr. Quick has mentioned, about the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and how that measures against the superpower rivalry against China. So it's possible that Southeast Asia will be a contested field, both militarily, financially, diplomatically, or in any other terms, of both parties. So it's important that Southeast Asia unites as much as we can, and health is a good way for us to unite. I give 3 sequential steps for ASEAN to consider how to move forward. The first step is very regular and structured information sharing. At the moment, information sharing is done on a very bilateral level, very ad hoc and a bit reactive. But if we can get the health ministers today, they meet, ASEAN health ministers meet every 2 years, and the Secretaries General of Health or the Directors General of Health also meet every 2 years. We need this to be more frequent and more regular and more structured. Information sharing is the first thing. Once you build trust and familiarity, you can do the second thing, which is joint programming. For example, disease prevention, disease control, education programs. All this joint programming is a second stage, because you have to start with information sharing to build networks, connections, trust, and familiarity first. You share information, you do joint programming, and the third and final thing that you can do is capacity sharing. This, to me, is a gold standard. And the gold standard will take place maybe 3, 5, 10 years from now, but we should start it today. Capacity sharing can be very simple. For example, you just share face masks. You can pre-position face masks or personal protective equipment or ventilators in selected capital cities around Southeast Asia. And that's a very simple form of capacity sharing. But more complicated capacity sharing will be mutual recognition of health professionals that a pandemic anywhere in Southeast Asia is a pandemic everywhere in Southeast Asia. To repeat that, a pandemic anywhere in Southeast Asia is a pandemic everywhere in Southeast Asia. And therefore, if you can send, for example, Filipino nurses or Thai doctors to Indonesia, I'm just inventing examples over here, because Indonesia is not perhaps having a high caseload, you're also assuring the health of your own country. Now, let me move on a little bit to end this analysis about ASEAN by saying, what does ASEAN not have at the moment, and which is building on to what the Republic of South Korea can work together with ASEAN. What ASEAN does not have at the moment is a strong convening function. There is one health division in ASEAN, but it's 1 out of 46 divisions. And there's only about 10 staffers in the health division in ASEAN, despite a stated ambition that health is very important and we want to collaborate more. So if you see that the lack of human capital inside the health division in the ASEAN Secretariat indicates a relative priority that health has in relation to the economy, to the military, and so on and so forth. And that's a good starting point for me to make my final set of comments, which is, what can the Republic of Korea and South Korea do together with ASEAN in a mutually beneficial win-win solution? I offer 2 thoughts over here. The first one is a convening function. The second one is technical expertise. As well, let's deal with the technical expertise first, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin there first. Technical expertise is reasonably straightforward. Korean experts will come over to Southeast Asia, or vice versa. We're opening bilateral or multilateral channels of communication that we can learn from the Korean experience, testing, tracing, and vertical integration. And once these vertically integrated health systems are available in Southeast Asia, we can make them a little bit more interoperable between one country and another. That's a technical expertise part, which is so far so normal. But let me expand a little bit about the concept of a convening function. What Southeast Asia at the moment lacks is perhaps a regional, a country that's large enough and powerful enough, however you define large and powerful, to convene the health collaboration that's necessary. In my experience and through my analysis, and many of my colleagues will agree with me as well, no such country in Southeast Asia can play this particular role. So it's not perhaps not Indonesia, despite their size, perhaps not Singapore, despite their sophistication, perhaps not Thailand or Vietnam, despite their successes in fighting COVID as well. So there is no, say, perfect figure that can play the neutral convening function. Therefore, nation states have the opportunity to come in and play a convening function role. And nation states would be like the United States of America. 3 weeks ago, the US State Department announced that the United States Center for Disease Control, the CDC, will support the creation of an ASEAN CDC. I welcome the support to create an ASEAN CDC. However, we should be mindful that this is one particular country coming in to provide their expertise. So if we were to have a multilateral approach or a more neutral party or a party which has no stake or interest, shall we say, in the geopolitical rivalry, this could be beneficial for ASEAN as well. I end with the following thoughts by saying that there are channels for ASEAN and South Korea to get started. The ASEAN Plus 3 forum is one good forum, but the ASEAN and ROK dialogue, which is now 30 years, I think is a more appropriate forum. A more appropriate forum because it's very direct, very bilateral, and also we have the benefit of 3 decades of collaboration. And that would be a very good starting point. And let me end my comments over here and over to you, Izzah.
Thank you, Dr. Koh. Just perhaps maybe your thoughts on your comments about cooperation and how you put the preference towards bilateral engagement with ROK through the ASEAN ROK engagement as opposed to ASEAN Plus 3. Given the importance of transparency and passing the necessary information and just about anything probably in this case, do you think that given one of the biggest sensitive points for these ASEAN nations is about their sovereignty, and to some of them, I think even their own personal data sets like the health and other sorts of infrastructure relevant to this may be at risk of being to them, being leaked or being known to others. I mean, Indonesia did have that problem a while ago with the WHO concerning the vaccines for swine flu, if I'm correct. So do you think something like that will pop up?
Yes, it will pop up. Sorry. Yes, questions of sovereignty, principles of non-interference, national security, vaccine sovereignty, vaccine nationalism, these are all concepts which are familiar in the international relations circuit. And they will be transferred to health if 2 things happen. Number 1, the Ministry of Health in a particular country does not stand their ground. And secondly, if at the same time the security or the economic agencies are overpowering or overwhelming the health agencies when making decisions vis-a-vis international relations and their internal health system. So I think it's definitely going to happen. However, I would say that the data is already being shared internationally. Every few years or so, the World Health Organization would insist on a report of the state of the health system of every country. And this data is already being collected by international organizations like the World Health Organization, secondly, by academic researchers in universities, thirdly, by health think tanks or healthcare think tanks, and fourthly, including by, shall we say, major international universities like Johns Hopkins or the University of Oxford. And if you want to talk about data sovereignty, maybe the data should really be shared within Southeast Asia, kept in Southeast Asia, in servers located in Southeast Asia, multilaterally between Southeast Asian nations, instead of, what shall we say, being sent to another continent just to be processed.
Thank you very much for that. We will now be moving on to Mr. Jeffrey C. We'll be connecting to him soon. Please unmute. Okay.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks Shuping for inviting me. Thanks the rest of the distinguished guests. Maybe I just give a bit of introduction about Chosun Exchange, what we do in Southeast Asia. And I think my focus will be very much more on, I think, where I see the collaboration and linkages between North Korea, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. And I think the immense value that Southeast Asia can bring to that process of reconciliation and economic integration. Let me just pop over to some of the slides. Just want to see if, I mean, is the picture clear on the screen? Yeah. Cool. Anyway, so just that you know, the organization I represent and founded is called Chosun Exchange. We've been in operation for slightly over a decade, running programs in North Korea to train and educate the next generation of economic policy makers and entrepreneurs and business people in the country. So helping them learn about entrepreneurship, business, and economics. So, on the, next to me is a picture of one of our workshop programs there, where we run these workshops in the country and have trained close to 3,000 North Koreans and brought about 100 or so of them out to the rest of the world. And a big part of our programs happen in Southeast Asia. Here is one of the groups that we brought to Malaysia a number of years ago. So they were visiting Magic. We brought them to MDAC, we brought them to Putrajaya. And they had a very great time there learning about kind of incubation and entrepreneurship. And actually this group went back to establish the first accelerator program in North Korea to kind of create that generation of startups in this town, just maybe 30 minutes north of Pyongyang, called Pyeongseong. So this was one of the workshops we did. This was another program we did in 2014 where we brought North Koreans to Vietnam, to Halong Bay. So these were the people who were looking at how to develop the Kangwon province in North Korea. So this includes your Wonsan, Kauma, Kumgan Mountain region. So they were there to explore how Vietnam is developing some of their coastal beach resorts and see if they can bring back concepts around it back to the country. And obviously, I'm from Singapore. And this is one of the programs we did in Singapore. As you can see, this picture is taken on top of the Marina Bay Sands. Every time we bring the North Koreans to Singapore, they insist on visiting it. And I noticed in 2018 when Kim Jong-un visited Singapore for his meeting with President Donald Trump, the route that he took around the Marina Bay Sands area basically mirrored the exact route that we generally bring our delegations when they came to visit Singapore. So just a bit of background about Choson Exchange. So I think the context and the contribution we made to the book that Chuping co-edited was around the capacity building that would take place for North Korea as they kind of develop their economy. And I think it was a suggestion for South Korea in some areas that they should focus on, they should think about, and really the role and value that Southeast Asia can bring to that process. And as part of a kind of, an ongoing effort, we've been looking a lot at this area, the Kangwon region. This is a picture actually taken from a scouting trip we did there end of 2019. It's a very beautiful place. And I think what we're trying to do is to kind of connect up how they would develop that region and why we think it's important to Northeast Asia. And the reason it's important is because if you look at it, it's an area where the North Koreans have focused a lot of economic attention on. They actually invested a lot in building up the infrastructure there. It's the closest point to, the closest point to Japan. They used to have a significant amount of trade taking place between this region. There's a port city there called Wonsan on the East Coast. And also it's used to host a lot of South Korean tourism in the area. So it's a very important spot in terms of interactions between North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. And as part of this, the North Koreans have always looked to Southeast Asia for some examples for how they would develop this sector and this region. I mentioned before we brought them to Halong Bay way back 6-7 years ago. And that's one of the areas they've been looking at. Prior to COVID-19 this year, we were exploring bringing the North Koreans to a number of other regions in Southeast Asia, mainly in Indonesia, to get exposure to how the tourism industries in those places have developed and the kind of policies that have supported, the kind of infrastructure that have supported. So I believe in this process of inter-Korean reconciliation, there is a lot that Southeast Asia can provide. And I think it's a very important role that we play. For the reason that I think for the North Koreans, they're generally very, they have a lot of pride. There are ideological concerns involved. So they generally, when you say like for North Koreans to say that, oh, we're going to learn from South Korea, it is very problematic. The North Koreans do not accept it. And I think in that area, Southeast Asia as a neutral region, and much more so than say the European Union or the United States or China, we kind of we can build that platform to allow the North Koreans to learn about, economic development and I think in a way that is not just that they kind of find acceptable, but also because of the diversity of Southeast Asia. We noticed that bringing them to like Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, which all have very different economic development strategies and situation and context, I think gives North Korea exposure to what they need to do at different stages of development, right? From where they are today to what they can look forward to, hopefully 20, 30 years down the road. So I think we play a very important role. We have that platform. And I think the mindset here is a lot less, there's the ASEAN kind of approach of doing things. And I think compared to the European Union, it's less, I would say, prescriptive, right? I think for the North Koreans, they know that, we don't try to impose certain policies on them. And I think for that reason, I think they find it a much better place to learn from and to get exposure. And it's just from a implementation point of view, also easier to bring them out to this part of the world. I believe the South Korean side, it's important for them to invest in inter-Korean engagement that is embedded in international forums. I think the traditional approach in South Korea is to say, oh, an inter-Korean relation is basically between us and North Korea. Maybe the US come in because of sanctions. But beyond that, I think there's a tendency to view it as an inter-Korean affair. That's it. I think there is great value to embedding some of these interactions and exchanges in knowledge, in norms, in international forums, of which ASEAN is a big one, because I think it helps tide over the relationship when given the ups and downs in inter-Korean relationship. So when the ties are bad, at least activities are still going on. North Koreans are getting the exposure and the learning they need, and South Korea is getting some understanding of how North Korea is changing and developing. So I think the platforms, our focus have always been in terms of programs, implementing programs in this part of the world, and we continue to do so alongside some programs we have in Europe. That said, I do think that from my experience looking at the situation in the last few years, it seems that the South Korean side has not have that much active interest in supporting training programs for the North Koreans in the context of this kind of international forums. So I think the traditional approach for them has still been to approach the North Koreans directly, and they only want to deliver programs if the North Koreans were willing to accept it directly from South Korea or South Korean institutions. And I do believe that it's a mindset that has to shift and has to take a kind of a broader and more long-term outlook in terms of how they should pursue positive changes within the country and in its economy. So I think that's kind of the broad outline of what I want to present, and looking forward to discussing some of this further later. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey, for that. I do have a question on the question about investments into the inter-Korean engagements.
Yep.
We've had quite a few history before, because we've had the six-party talks, we've had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we've had a few other types where somewhere in there the goal is to bring North Korea into the fold of some sort of institution. But even a lot, there's with very limited success historically. But given with what's happening now and the sort of engagements that the Choson Exchange and everything has been doing, what is it about? Is there something particular in the ASEAN platform that is more appealing?
I think two things. One is, if you look at, say, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is one of the events where the North Koreans have very consistently attended vis-a-vis other forums. And I think that's an example where I think ASEAN neutrality has in some way paved the way for that kind of interaction. And while, we can't set too high expectation what can be achieved at these forums, I think just the fact that they have consistently attended, it becomes a platform for some level of exchange in terms of opinions, and also for North Korea to hear what the international community thinks. I think that is very valuable. I think for us, what we have found, and I think where ASEAN can play a major role, is that we can involve North Koreans in programs and training and interactions in the region that are not tied to the core nuclear issue, but play a very important part in the thinking of North Korea. So for us, we focus on the economic angle, and I think there are many different other angles that are also very valuable. And the reason for that is because most other countries are not willing to touch those issues until denuclearization has been achieved. So most of the other forums have focused primarily on the nuclear issue. The six-party talks is all about that issue. But I think there needs to be kind of more long-term forums for North Korea to interact with the world and discuss other issues or to learn about other things. That is needed for kind of broader transformation of their society and their economy. And I think that's where ASEAN can provide some of these things.
Thank you. And now we shall be going to our discussions. We will be getting not only just Norliana, we'll have Dr. Yoon. Dr. Choi, sorry. My bad, I can't see. We'll start with Dr. Choi.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Congratulations to ISIS and Korea Foundation for providing this wonderful book lunch and seminar dedicated to the new Southern policy and ASEAN-ROK Partnership. I'm truly honored to be part of this meaningful event. I would like to thank all the presenters for making such a very complete presentation on each topic. First, Professor Dr. Kwik Song-ki successfully laid down the basis of my debate. So thank you. Some of the points will be made during my discussion. Second presenter, Dr. Ko Si-King. I think the success of the Korea's fight against the COVID-19 could be made because due to the experts like you. So and I have one question, but we'll be get back later after my discussion. And finally, Mr. Jeffrey C., I did greatly appreciate all the efforts you've made to help young Earth Koreans. I think having other active players like Joseon Exchange in improving inter-Korean relations would be critical and very helpful. Thank you. So I will begin my discussion by just a very brief discussion on the diplomatic scene where we are situated in, which Professor Kwik Song-ki just mentioned as Cold War 2.0. It is becoming evident that COVID-19 is more than just a pandemic. COVID-19 era paints a more worrisome picture. One of the notable changes brought by COVID-19 is the strengthening of the anti-Chinese front. The US government is more harshly pushing to expand the US-led quadrilateral security dialogue, or Quad, involving its regional allies, namely Australia, Japan, and India. And the goal of the states is to make the Indo-Pacific region work together as a bulwark against a potential challenge from China. This is quoted by the comments of the US Deputy Secretary Steve Biegun last month. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is making the 5-day trip to 3 NATO countries, Greece, Italy, Croatia, and will visit Japan early October to have Japan, Australia, and India foreign ministers meeting. But just before that, Pompeo is expected to visit Korea, presumably starting October 7th, right after Korea's 5-day Chuseok holiday. Pompeo during this trip may try to gain Korea's support over trade and security matters with China and push for South Korea to participate in such an expanded Quad structure. After Pompeo, Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Yi will visit Korea very soon. So the current tension poses a tremendous threat to middle power states like ASEAN and Korea. But fortunately, IPS, Indo-Pacific Strategy, Quad, and SCRI, new initiative mooted by Japan, Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, still remain in its conceptual stage. Therefore, there is still room and opportunity along with risk in what China and the United States intend to achieve are not necessarily realized in the process of their hegemonic competition. So the strategy of making appropriate engagement to both the US and China is very necessary. The ASEAN and Korea, which cannot take sides with either of them, should be the ones that create a space for such discussion and cooperation. International law and multilateralism are important in preventing superpowers from taking everything for themselves. And ASEAN and Korea should be the major players that create a new regional cooperation framework like the Indo-Pacific strategy. Agreements have been made in many previous dialogues regarding this issue. I would like to emphasize that this concerted initiative has become inevitable after COVID-19. Then our next question should be how. Considering the time constraints, I will present 3 agendas very briefly, expecting that we can continue to discuss in our endeavor to further ASEAN-ROK cooperation through New Southern Policy. First is to have economic resilience in our region. So both Korea and ASEAN have well demonstrated our economic resilience. Korea and ASEAN are the economies least impacted by COVID-19. But there are new engagements coming out during this pandemic, asserting to build resilience in the region, where ASEAN and Korea are not explicitly part of. One of those engagements is the one that I just mentioned, SCRI, proposed by Australia, India, and Japan on September 1st. Committed to building resilient supply chains in the Indo-Pacific in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, the initiative is set to fundamentally reshape the geographical character of cross-border production network containing China. In this regard, we have to rethink the value of RCEP, how we can further elaborate it in responding to those new challenges. RCEP should not be branded as a China-centered economic system, nor as some system blocking any economy. It started in ASEAN and its 5 partner countries, but should be open and transparent in its system and operation of member states. RCEP still has a potential to further improve its details. In addition to pursue its interests in traditional trade measures, such as tariffs and rules of origin, we should pay more deliberate attention to explore a constructive approach to encourage trade and economic growth in coping with the challenges posed by recent difficulties. The fair trade order will be function as backbone of efficiently working global value chain in this region. So we can formulate a RCEP as the backbone of a newly emerging regional integration initiative, not joining to other initiatives like SCRI. Okay, so I will move to the second point. The second point is related to the having new cooperative mechanism. So, which is to say we have to have institutional resilience in our partnership. We do not want a New Southern Policy to remain as a campaign under a specific regime and disappear afterward. Although the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy exists, there are no legal apparatus or instruments to make it function on a mandatory basis. We have the ASEAN-ROK Cooperation Fund, ASEAN-Korea Action Plan, and have recently added Korea-Mekong cooperation to enhance cooperation among 5 countries alongside Mekong River. But we will need also mechanisms for enduring cooperation among the remaining 5 maritime countries. Thus, I'd like to propose a cooperation mechanism with 5 maritime countries to increase the level of completion and the continuity of New Southern Policy. There must be some concerns that this kind of new mechanism might become a hindrance to ASEAN centrality and unity. Nevertheless, Korea is undoubtedly one of the partner states that vehemently supports ASEAN unity. Korea looks forward to the ASEAN developing into a regional hub than any other states. So if we have time, we may have further time to discuss in this issue. My final point will be the partnership resilience. The existing consultative mechanism in ASEAN should work as a platform on which countries with different interests can build trust through dialogue, as Professor Crick also made this point. This existing consultative mechanism in ASEAN should work as a platform on which countries with different interests can build trust through dialogue. For instance, cooperation with India, a regional powerhouse, should be considered more important to enhance regional resilience. At present, there is little chance of joining India in RCEP. However, India's role in such a consultative body as the Asian NATO pushed by the United States and the SCRI driven by India, Japan, Australia should be seriously taken into consideration. This is it for my discussion, and I'm going to ask one more question to Dr. Kusi King. Can I? Do I have time to make question?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Can I have time to ask one question to Mr. Dr. Kusi King?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Maybe later?
Oh, actually, yeah. Can we get
Yep. Okay.
Anna to speak first, and then we can do, when we do a Q&A,
Okay.
we can do this an exchange.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Izzah. And I think thank you to all the rest of the panel members on very interesting topics. I think it also gives us a good, diverse view on where we head after the pandemic, if there is an after to the pandemic, which I think is the big question today. So when we talk about the new normal, the idea is, do we continue forward forging on this new normal to become the normal, or is it an expectation that we can return back to business as usual? And I think in most part, what we have to be prepared for is that there is no business as usual as per se. There's a lot of things that the pandemic has shown to us that we are woefully inadequate or unprepared for to face something of this global scale. And yet it is something that we must do. So some of the lessons I think that we have learned from the experience of going through the COVID-19 is that economic development and technological development is not an indicator of exactly how well and how efficient a country can respond and react to such a global disaster, if I may use the word, but rather it's a matter of resiliency as well as a quickness to learn and a willingness to adapt to the necessary precautions and trade-offs that has to come in order for us, or in order for any country to be able to effectively respond. So overall, I think that in going forward with the New Southern Policy 2.0, the question now is, how do we consider using these strengths that we've had? One of the things about the NSP is the broad manner in which it approaches the relationship between ASEAN and South Korea. It is a strength in the fact that it is flexible to allow us to look at the various areas of cooperation which we can then take advantage of. But it can also be a weakness because when they say everything can also mean nothing. So those are the things that we have to consider when we move forward with the NSP through 2.0. So we've looked at how there are three pillars of ASEAN, and I think Professor Quay has looked at political security. We've also covered health, which falls under social culture, as well as economic exchanges in the training that Mr. Joffrey has done. I would like to point out three things that I think would benefit in terms of how we approach the NSP from here. First is how we prioritize. When we look at the different interests, obviously national interests diverge not only among the 10 ASEAN member countries, but for South Korea as well. It would be naive for us to assume that any engagement we make at an international level is only out of the goodwill of being a global community. Obviously, every country has interests as well, but protecting your own interest does not mean that you are not also engaging in the interests of all other countries too. So by prioritizing where interests converge, generally we are then able to see what can we benefit from the relations that we build on the NSP 2.0. More than that, we must reevaluate which cooperation matters the most by prioritizing, because then these common areas of interest can be pursued and taken advantage of at a lesser scale or at lesser means of obstacles. Such as the example that Prof. Quick has pointed out, non-military platforms and economic interdependency has made the context of US-China rivalry very different from the US-Soviet Cold War area. And in that sense, these are advantages that we should be able to take off. Once we've established interest, another thing we have to be considered, or things that we have to be willing to think about, is trade-off. We have things that we prioritize, but in the sense of setting those prioritizations, what are we willing to let go of in order to pursue and achieve these prioritized and common goals? So the first part of the NSP has focused on traditional and obvious areas of cooperation, but the pandemic has changed that. So obviously there are areas that we can no longer pursue and we will need to let go. So in areas that are affected, such as tourism, education, infrastructure development, these are things that would consider or would need international travel, would need movement of people, which are now limited in today's scope and context. So in the worst case scenario, if there is no way back, are we willing to make the trade-offs? And if there are no trade-offs, the next question is, how do we then find acceptable alternatives to pursue these areas of cooperation? So looking at our speakers today, in terms of the geopolitical aspect, perhaps I can pose the question on what then do you think, Professor, can be prioritized in order to best push forward the cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN? In the case of public health partnership, which I think is a really underdeveloped area between ASEAN and South Korea. If we look at the 2019 agreement or point of action that was released in Busan for 2020 to 2025 for the NSP, health was only a subsection under social culture cooperation. So it was actually a much smaller level of cooperation when it was initially discussed, but now has become a huge part when we look at how diplomatically South Korea has made a big impact in ASEAN, as pointed out quite rightly by Dr. Kaur. So if that is the case, my question then is, do you think, Dr. Kaur, by focusing on public health cooperation, there are areas where we make trade-offs? For example, in the case of America, where there is problems of people not willing to make trade-offs to personal privacy and freedoms for the larger sake of health and public security. Do you think ASEAN and in that sense is a different place, and by focusing on the need to cooperate and enhance public health, countries will need to make those trade-offs? And finally, this question of alternatives, and I think this goes directly, quite cleanly into what Mr. Geoffrey was talking about, where due to certain changes and technical trainings that happen or can no longer happen, what are the alternatives that we can have in order to pursue capability building for North Korea, South Korea, and ASEAN going forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all our speakers today. Now we'll be entering the Q&A session. So we'll be receiving both questions from anyone on the floor here. You guys are totally fine to ask. And also we'll be accepting them virtually as well. But in the meantime, for those who are still formulating questions, our speakers, would you like to respond to Dr. Nuliana's comments?
Lynn, thank you for your questions. I'll respond in two ways. The first one is small, the second one is large. The small way is to talk about the interdependence that yourself and Professor Quick has spoken about, Dr. Nuliana and Professor Quick. The interdependence of countries for health reasons should be done carefully and appropriately so that the interdependence is not weaponized against you. Meaning, if a country A is dependent on country B or interdependent on country B, for supplies of face masks, or supplies of test kits and reagents, and so on and so forth, be careful that that is not used against you. So the interdependence of economic, political terms, diplomatic terms, and health terms, we must take care that they're not weaponized against you. That's my first smaller point. The broader question that Dr. Nungala has asked just now is, how do nation states, and the world is organized around nation states at the moment, how do nation states handle the social contract as it relates to health and pandemics and public health? There is a trade-off. The trade-off is between the personal rights and duties of the individual and the rights and duties of the state as well. And in that trade-off, in general terms, and speaking very generally, East Asian countries and Asian countries have demonstrated a greater ability to form a cohesive social contract during this pandemic, as opposed to the politicization of even wearing a face mask in many countries in the West. There are several reasons for this. The memories, our memories of SARS and MERS and H1N1 is much fresher compared to the countries in the West. Therefore, there's a little bit more, it's easier for governments to persuade their citizens to take one for the team and to consider the public implications of your personal actions. And there are several other smaller structural reasons as well. But without going into all those reasons, and to be a little briefer about this, I agree with Dr. Nuliana that the social contract appears to be more cohesive. There appears to be more social cohesion and solidarity within Asian countries as they are fighting this pandemic. And there could be some sociological, anthropological, historical, maybe even economic lessons here for other countries around the world as well. Let me pause my comments here. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to build on what Dr. Koh has just mentioned, and again back to what Dr. Noliana has already highlighted about the trade-off issue. And always, as a student of international politics or policy, I always think that we can only use one word to talk about or unpack the dynamic of policy or policy process. It's really about trade-off. And I would add that it is not the trade-off, but trade-offs, because clearly there are competing values. It's not like just two. Just take an example of something that Dr. Koh highlighted during his excellent presentation on those like vaccine diplomacy and also the data sovereignty, who to share, with to what extent, what kind of information that we should work together, that sort of things. The kind of a trade-off that faced by all countries. When I say all countries, it's not just individual ASEAN countries, but also South Korea and possible partners for ASEAN, is that I think our decision, you talk about acceptable decision, right? Out of all these trade-offs, I would think that there will be at least three factors that will come into picture for any countries, big and small, in or out of the region. It's about three R's. One is about resources, right? What kind of resources that you yourself as a country has, yeah? Norena is correct to say that economic development is one factor, but there are many other resilience and all that, right? So it's about the resources and also the resilience. That's the first R. But given the competition and geopolitical competition, I would think that the other R is also about the relations, power relations. Are you going with, in the light of a US-China competition, are you going to collaborate more with one camp over the other? Clearly, this is not a ideal situation. So I would think that power relations, the second R, play a big role as well. And then finally, will be a very big reality for every one of us. It will be about the reliability of the vaccine provided, right? At the moment, we are not quite sure who actually has the best reliable option. So the reliability, power relationship, and also the resources and resilience that you have, that these three are, I believe that will be the key factors. They will be addressing the very trade-off issues that you have mentioned so clearly, so well.
We do have, sorry.
Oh, should I chime in to respond to Noliana's comment now?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the question she asked was around alternatives, right? What can be done now? And I think in the context, the two speakers talk about the broader geostrategics around, how people respond to the COVID situation. I think in our case, it's a much more micro example, but I always believe in my background is as an entrepreneur. I believe that the way we react to the situations is to hopefully find the silver lining, the opportunity in all of it. And I think in our case, that has been very much the situation, right? I think where ASEAN can continue to provide this training and education that's needed is that one is that we actually have a decent diaspora of North Koreans living in Southeast Asia. who still and will go back to Pyongyang at some point. And I think it's an opportunity to provide education programs to that group, and it's something that we have focused on. The other part is the opportunity to encourage the adoption of digital channels for the North Koreans to learn about some of these key topics. And that's also something that we have started doing and have had some success with it. I think the main, I feel like an important point from operationalizing some of these approaches is that I think there needs to be agility and urgency in terms of thinking about these programs. I think very often when we talk to the whole supply chain needed to deliver such programs, to sponsors and so on, there's a tendency to think that, oh, we can't deliver it now, it's fine. Like, let's just wait until things go back to normal and then deliver the usual programs in person. I think that world has changed. And I think this pandemic has actually been a waking kind of waking experience to encourage us to innovate and hopefully to force the entire supply chain of sponsors and content providers to innovate too in how we deliver such activities.
Thank you. Professor Choi, I recall that you wanted to ask a question earlier. Would you like to ask it now? You're muted.
It was answered partly and from the previous discussion from Dr. Juliana. And I'm still wondering, because Dr. Ko Si-King mentioned that ASEAN-Korea dialogue is a very efficient platform to, promote our cooperative partnership. But if you think ASEAN has its many dialogue partners, and the nature of this treatment against the virus should be very interdependent in nature, and also there would require kind of overlapping efforts from the side of ASEAN. Is it still? Do you think still the ASEAN-Korea dialogue is an efficient platform to discuss this matter, or is it could be kind of a more expanded form of ASEAN and more broadened partnership, like EAS and APT, like this?
Would anyone like to answer? Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Choi. If I understand your question correctly, you're asking about the interdependence, the elements of interdependence, and how that can be applied between ROK and ASEAN. Can you please confirm this is a question first?
Yes. So this dialogue mechanism, is it regarded as a basic platform that we cooperate? Or can we think of any other mechanism other than Korea-ASEAN dialogue?
Oh, right. Thank you. Yes, I can think of several other mechanisms other than the current ASEAN-ROK dialogue. However, according to what Professor Quick says earlier, so I'm building on what he said, I believe in trying to strengthen existing systems and platforms and dialogues without creating new ones. The world has very many dialogues right now, and often we fall prey to the problem of let's create a new institution or entity thinking that it will be a magic solution that will solve all our problems. I wish that there was an Asean Cdc that could bypass, shall we say, the 3 I's of the ASEAN Secretariat, for example. But I'm aware of the fact that no matter how you create or capitalize an ASEAN Cdc, you have to go through the ASEAN Secretariat. So it's in everyone's best interest to strengthen the ASEAN-ROK dialogue rather than to create a brand new entity. And that is my personal opinion. Thank you.
Hello. We have one question online. I think there's a question from Dr. Steve. Dr. Steve, you actually want to go first with the question, or do I just read the question online?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a little bit more about this issue that will come up in the next 12, 18 months, and that is vaccine diplomacy. You talked a little bit about vaccine nationalism. Maybe it's time to start thinking about that. I can envisage, for example, that China will seek to spread its influence throughout this region, by offering. India has already indicated that they want to supply vaccines to the world. So everyone is looking at this, with a view to not only providing vaccine, but also to, creating greater influence, diplomacy, and whatever comes as a result of it. So I see that it will basically be a contestation in this region between probably India and China, for the hearts and minds. I don't know how Europe and the US are going to come into this, because they are thinking in more commercial terms. So in this light, what do you know, or what can we think about that for countries like Korea and ASEAN countries, we can start to sort of prepare these platforms that you talk about, the structures. They're good for discussing issues, but not very good for kind of things that are right in your face, right now. You have to decide. When it comes time, we'll all scramble, and we'll all have multiple approaches. Some will accept Russian vaccines, some whatnot. So how do we make order of this, and what can a Korea ASEAN thing do to make more sense in organization?
Thank you so much, Dr. Steve. I'm just going to read the last question from Ms. Ruthara Mary. She asked a question in regards to Southern policy, and it's 3 Ps: people, prosperity, and peace, but specifically on the peace pillar. I would like to ask how ASEAN and Korea could strengthen and pursue their cooperation in the peace pillar and in the new Southern policy proposed. So I suppose Mr. Jeffrey C. and Dr. Kwek can actually certainly respond to that. Mr. C, would you like to take the floor? Your mic is muted, sorry.
Sorry about that. As I mentioned, I think one of the key areas we can contribute, which I think is an important issue for the Korean Peninsula, is the ability to play the role as facilitator and matchmaker and educator with the North Koreans, and bring them to the kind of interactions that would bring both Korea to the table eventually. The economic issue may not be the most immediate issue to tackle when it comes to the broader kind of nuclear issue that's at play. But I do think it plays a very important supporting role, because at the end of the day, for the North Koreans, the objective of a denuclearization process has to achieve for them the ability to integrate into the world peacefully, preserve their security, and ensure their economic development and security. And I think one of the key things that's emphasized when their leader Kim Jong-un came to Singapore was the idea that if they take the right steps today, they would see the kind of economic development that Singapore has seen and other parts of Southeast Asia has seen. And I think that plays a very important part in the mindset of the North Koreans. And I think that is the key role we can play in terms of helping both Koreas achieve peace and reconciliation. And I think it should also be seen in a very long-term perspective, where I think for South Korea, it's not about immediately coming here to meet North Koreans, but I think also to set up a framework and a system for them to kind of get the channels to knowledge that they need to change the economy.
Thank you very much.
Maybe very, very quickly, again, about the issue of under NSP, new Southern policy, the peace pillar. So I would definitely think that there are a number of things that we could focus. let's talk about three areas that should be the focus. And again, it's in the spirit of not creating a new wheel, but rather to substantiating what already is taking place, but perhaps not enough. So these three areas clearly under a peace pillar would be number one, about the defense aspect. Yeah, it's I would think that there is a huge potential between South Korea and also ASEAN to really strengthen what I would think that big potential because of the similarities in the geopolitical context shared by both sides. So those things like, for example, defense industry, maritime security, so on and so forth. So I think there is a big potential that both sides can enhance and do more. And then second sector would be on the non-traditional security aspect. With COVID-19 pandemic, cooperation clearly should be given higher priority and also more resources. But clearly there are also other non-traditional security aspects such as HADR, cyber, so on and so forth. Yeah, and South Korea with the comparative advantage in ICT clearly has I think a lot of attraction as well as selling point. The third one I would think that is relatively overlooked, but that's precisely what I would say shared by South Korea and also Southeast Asia that could do more. And that's about ensuring regional, to avoid the regional polarization. I think, again, it's, I would say that the elephant in the room. And I do see a lot of similarities between South Korea and also Southeast Asian countries, despite the fact that South Korea is a US ally. But you do see a lot of similarities how South Korea respond to a number of issues that are sensitive when it comes to US-China rivalry. For example, South China Sea, South Korea keep a distance. Southeast Asian countries all keep some distance in a very careful way. And even in the issue of Indo-Pacific and even about the Quad, South Korea, again, as a US ally, has chosen not to join Quad. And whether this will change, we do not know. But the real test will be about the Quad Plus. And this is slowly emerging. It will be interesting that whether or not South Korea would really officially join Quad Plus, and whether or not any of the ASEAN countries would do something similar. But I do think that sometimes multiple or overlapping arrangement can be a good thing. It might not be efficient, but at least allow us to avoid taking side and avoid regional polarization that is shared with all countries in the region. Thanks.
Steve, thank you for your question. I'll share the following few thoughts. The first one is to say that vaccine diplomacy is very different from test kit diplomacy or face mask diplomacy. Test kits and face masks are much less controversial than vaccines for any number of reasons. There are also dangers to vaccine diplomacy in the sense that the current vaccines that we have is dramatically accelerated. Usually it's 5 to 7 years. Right now we're crash testing a vaccine and crash approving and trying to come out with a vaccine in 1 year. Therefore, there could be adverse events, there could be quality control problems. First generation vaccines were sacrificing speed, in exchange for speed, we're sacrificing quality in the sense that the vaccines will often have to be transported at very cold temperatures, much colder than usual. This gives, say, the risk of very many problems, which is why vaccine diplomacy is something that nations should be very careful in engaging in. Making face masks is a lot easier than making, say, vaccines, shall we say. However, there are opportunities for vaccine diplomacy, and I'll get to that in a second. The second thing I'll say is that there is a tension right now between your responsibility as a country to your citizens, voters, and taxpayers, and your responsibility to the global community. And it is my prediction, if I may be so bold as to make a prediction, that vaccine diplomacy will be a little later, as in stage 2. In stage 1, countries will want to ensure that their own citizens get their vaccines first in order to preserve or increase their political legitimacy and increase their governing capabilities. So vaccine diplomacy will be a feature of the landscape, but perhaps a little later. The third and final comment that I'll make is regarding the existing infrastructure that we have at the moment. It would be great if we had the United Nations General Assembly in order to make distribution decisions and manage the ethics of distribution and so on and so forth. But the United Nations framework is only 75 years old. It's not fit for purpose in this world where nation states and nationalism is prevalent. Therefore, there was this entity that was created called the COVAX facility where 150-something countries have signed up, 2/3 of the world's population, in order to ensure as equitable an access as possible to the vaccine. That entity is necessary, however, it's very imperfect. And it's important that the COVAX facility leaders do not sell the COVAX facility as the be-all, end-all magic solution that will solve everything that the international decision-making framework has failed to solve for the last 75 years. Let me go back to my final point, which is about ASEAN and what can ASEAN offer, and together with ROK, in a few ways. Number one is manufacturing. Number two is implementation. ASEAN and ROK has a lot of manufacturing capacity in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Singapore, even in parts of Indonesia, as well as in the Republic of Korea. There is a lot of manufacturing capacity that if we can ensure vaccines for, I think, 700 million people, combined ASEAN plus ROK, then we can export these vaccines out to other people as well. Number two is the implementation of it. In vaccine diplomacy terms, it's fraught with a lot of ethical problems. Say religion comes in. Southeast Asia can lead in religion, for example, where we provide the religious and legal infrastructure and bring appropriate religious leaders to come in. Southeast Asia can also implement vaccine or mass vaccination programs in, I would say, tractable conflict situations, like Southern Philippines, like the refugee situation in Myanmar. These are very difficult situations to resolve, but I would argue that if we can do well in Southern Philippines and in Myanmar, then we could be able to show lessons to Uganda or Lebanon that houses lots of refugees, maybe even countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I would argue that Southeast Asia is more tractable and allows us to have more solutions for the implementation of a mass vaccination program for the whole world. Thank you, Dr. C.
And with that note, we will be concluding our panel for today. I would like to thank everybody, both our discussants and our speakers, for their wonderful insights. I shall go turn to Harish. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Ms. Izzah and distinguished role players. We will be taking a short break and will resume with the book launching ceremony in 15 minutes.